thank our guests today. Thank you for everyone to coming on this call. And a very special thank you to our guest speaker, Tony Pecinovsky. Tony's the president of the St. Louis Worker Society. He also writes many articles for the People's World. And his most recent book, which I'm a huge fan of, is Let Them Tremble, Biographical Interventions Marking 100 Years of the Communist Party USA. And it's now available at international publishers. Tony, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I'm glad to be here. If it's okay with everybody, maybe for folks that are less familiar with the first book, I could give a brief overview of the main personalities and history that's outlined in that book, and then as we discussed, maybe a little bit of a teaser about the second book and the work that I've done with it over the past 6 or 8 months, and then maybe we could have some question and answer and back and forth. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. So the genesis for Let Them Tremble actually started 5 or 6 years ago, around the 95th anniversary of the party's birth, and the realization at that time that someone needed to begin years in advance to try to capture the amazing history that is the history of the Communist Party USA, as well as try to tell that story through a number of key personalities who influenced the party in multiple different ways. Some of the personalities that are covered in the book is a collection of 6 short-ish biographies of prominent leaders of the Communist Party, and each essay in the collection, each chapter, is roughly about 20,000 words, and so it's a good read, it's digestible, but what I wanted to do was to tell the story of the Communist Party through narrative lives, and so I wanted to tell the story of these people's lives and how their lives impacted U.S. politics. And so the main personalities, not the only, but the main personalities that are discussed in Let Them Tremble are Arnold Johnson, Charlene Mitchell, Gus Hall, Henry Winston, Judith LeBlanc, and W. Alpheus Hunton. And just a little bit about each of those personalities to maybe whet the appetite if you haven't yet read the book. Arnold Johnson, his story revolves around the Communist Party's defense of the Bill of Rights. During the late 1940s, throughout the 1950s, Arnold Johnson was the legislative and political director of the Communist Party, and wrote extensively on how the defense of the Communist Party against the Smith and McCarran Acts and McCarthyism in general were in reality a defense of the Bill of Rights, and that it was the Communist Party that was the staunchest defenders of U.S. Bill of Rights, of freedom of speech, of freedom of association, of the fight for equality. And one of the main points that I outline through Arnold Johnson's voice, through his write-ins, speeches, correspondence with his wife, correspondence with other communists, was that this defense of the Communist Party and the defense of the Bill of Rights was also heavily centered on the fight for equality for African Americans. And so we see, though Arnold Johnson never gave it this name, we begin to see what I call a red-black alliance emerge. And this alliance took many different shapes and forms throughout the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But this red-black alliance spearheaded and in many ways was the vanguard of what became the modern civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s. And so I take Arnold Johnson's story as this political legislative director of the Communist Party and kind of try to move the historical narrative forward post-1956 as well, because as I'm sure all of you are aware, much of the history of the Communist Party comes to an end in 1956 with the Khrushchev revelations, with the near decade of political repression, again, the Smith and McCarran Acts, and the imprisonment and deportation of major party leaders, as well as some internal security measures that were very damaging to the party. And so much of the history of US communism comes to an end in 1956. And so part of the challenge of Arnold Johnson's story, as well as the story of the other 5 personalities in Let Them Tremble, is to carry that historical narrative forward post-1956. And so with Arnold Johnson, I also highlight, starting in the 1960s, the early 1960s into the mid and late 1960s, Arnold Johnson transitioned his responsibilities from the political legislative director to the chair of the party's peace commission. And so I began to tell the story of the role of communists in the anti-Vietnam War peace movement that emerged in the mid-1960s and into the 70s. And so Arnold Johnson very quickly becomes a leader and was added to the steering committees of all of the various numerous peace organizations that emerged. The most prominent of which was the New Mobilization to End the War in Vietnam. Other well-known communists like Bettina Apted-Kerr, daughter of historian Herbert Apted-Kerr, became a well-known leader in student mobilization against the war, as well as one of the key leaders of the Berkeley Free Speech movement, and was actually the initiator of the student strike against the war that nearly 1 million students participated in. This is one of the largest student strikes in history that was initiated by a communist. And then another example, and then I'll move on to the next personality, that I try to, all of these lives intersect and intermingle, but another example of communist participation in the anti-Vietnam War peace movement was this support of the Fort Hood 3. Now, the Fort Hood 3 were the first GIs to refuse to deploy to Vietnam and were court-martialed and sentenced to years of prison and hard labor. 2 of those 3 GIs were members of the Communist Party. And that is largely unknown, but that was another one of the contributions that communists made to this, anti-Vietnam War peace movement. Oftentimes the story of the 1960s and 70s is the story of the mainstream or more well-known civil rights organizations, or the more well-known youth groups like Students for a Democratic Society, or even the Black Panther Party and other organizations. And oftentimes the story of communist participation in these various movements is neglected. And so one of the things that I try to do throughout the entire book is highlight how the lives of communists and the role of the Communist Party intersected with all of these various movements, and were very much a part of these movements, and contrary to the dominant historical narrative, were far from a marginal political force. So moving right along, the next section, next chapter deals with Charlene Mitchell. Charlene Mitchell became in 1968, she was African-American party leader. She became in 1968 the first African-American woman to run for president of the United States. Now, this is a historic moment, not only for civil rights, but also for feminism. A few years later, Shirley Chisholm would become the first major party candidate to run for president of the United States, but Charlene Mitchell was the first party, candidate. And so Charlene Mitchell's story is really interesting, not only because of what she did to run for president of the United States and what it took to get communists on the ballot across the country, despite decades of political repression and a concerted effort to keep communists off the ballot. She eventually was able to register and run in a number of different states. The turnout wasn't large, as you would expect, because of the decades of political repression. But it was an important moment in political history. And so we wanted to, share that history. And then fast forward just a couple years, and one of Charlene's best friends, Angela Davis, whom we all are aware was tried on trumped-up charges of murder and was eventually acquitted. But a worldwide campaign, the United Free Angela Davis Defense Committees or something like that, of which there were about 200 local committees across the country, spearheaded this fight to gain Angela Davis her freedom. Well, the executive director of this nationwide coalition to free Angela Davis was Charlene Mitchell. And out of the acquittal of Davis, there emerged what became the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, which Charlene Mitchell became the founding executive director of. And I illustrate this point to, again, make the point that far from being marginal, the Communist Party and communists were very much an integral part of the emerging movements against racist and political repression. And there were a number of historic cases that the National Alliance helped to spearhead the defense of. For example, Joanne Little in North Carolina, who was an African-American woman already in jail. She was assaulted by a prison guard who had an ice pick who intended to rape her while she was in her cell. She defended herself, and in the act of self-defense, kills the prison guard. The National Alliance, under Angela Davis and Charlene Mitchell's leadership, took up the defense of Joanne Little, and ultimately she became, now mind you, this is the mid-1970s, ultimately Joanne Little became the first African-American woman in US history to be acquitted of murder in self-defense against rape. Now, that's crazy, right? That in the mid-1970s, that this was the first case in US history of an African-American woman in defense against rape was acquitted of murder. So anyway, I carry Charlene Mitchell's story forward into the 1980s and into the early 1990s, and eventually with her split with the party in the 1991 convention. The next chapter deals with Gus Hall. And Gus Hall, as I'm sure all of you are aware, was for many decades the General Secretary of the Communist Party, National Chair, General Secretary, one or the other. And, I tried to tell the story of Gus Hall's contributions from 1959 forward. It was in 1959 at the party's convention that Gus Hall became officially the General Secretary and embarked upon a very ambitious wave of hugely successful college and university speaking engagements. And again, I wanted to illustrate this point of the role of communists in the growing and emerging youth and student upsurge, because it challenges this dominant historical narrative that communists became a marginal political force post-1956. So when we looked at the historical record, when we looked at newspaper clippings, when we looked at the internal communications between party members, when we looked at numerous other examples, we find that far from being marginal, communists like Gus Hall and Herbert Aptheker and James Jackson and Dorothy Healy and Daniel Rubin and others, far from being marginal, that these communists were being met on university and college campuses with tens of thousands of people in attendance to come and hear them speak. This was far from a marginal movement. In fact, I would actually liken it to the tens of thousands of people that were around the country coming to hear Bernie Sanders speak. Because that's what it was. And for example, in January, February of 1962, Gus Hall was on a West Coast speaking engagement. And at the University of Oregon alone, 12,000 students showed up to hear Gus Hall speak about the Communist Party. And this is a pretty, this is far from marginal. And so I carry Gus Hall's story forward into the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s until he passes. And then I try to make the point that his legacy isn't just a legacy of being a founder of the Steelworkers Union, which he was, It isn't just a legacy of being an internationalist who worked very closely with various communist parties across the world, which it was, but it was also a legacy of helping to build a youth and student movement, a communist, network within the youth and student movement. And so we find in the late 1950s and early 1960s, these communist-led initiatives like the Advance Youth Organization, the Progressive Youth Organizing Committee, and then in 1964, the W.E.B. Du Bois Clubs, and then later the Young Workers' Liberation League, which was in existence until the early 1980s, and it became the Young Communist League. And so this is a very important contribution that Gus Hall and other communists made, and also one that challenges this historical narrative that communists became a marginal political force post-1956. And a couple of the really interesting documents that I found was a letter sent by the party's Lecture and Information Bureau to hundreds of college campuses and college student organizations across the country. And one of the things that is noted in this letter from the Lecture and Information Bureau is that up to that year, I think the letter was sent in September, October of 62, 63, that year alone, communists spoke with cumulatively 75,000 students. Again, far from marginal movement. Gus Hall would boast in spring of 1962, in June or July of 1962, that he alone spoke with somewhere in the ballpark of 50,000 students just that year, the first 6 months of that year. So again, far from marginal movement. So we move forward to the next chapter in the book, Henry Winston. And one of the things that the point that I try to make with Henry Winston's life is that, it was at the neglect of U.S. prison authorities that Henry Winston, lost his eyesight. But even though his eyesight was gone, his vision remained, and his vision was one of African-American equality and Black liberation. His vision was one of what I again call a red-black alliance, where communists who had historically been the staunchest, allies of African-Americans found that their alliance, that their support of African-Americans was very welcome, and that as a result, anti-communism among African-Americans was significantly less than what it is among Caucasian, people. And so Henry Winston's story is a really interesting story because if you follow his life's work from the 1930s forward, you find that he was an activist with the National Negro Council, the NNC, which was one of the main Popular Front organizations that the party helped to initiate and lead in the 1930s into the 1940s. You also find that Winston, who became the organizational secretary of the party in the 1940s and into the 1950s, used exhaustive documentation in his reports to party leaders about the early impact of the McCarthy era and the Red Scare. And one of the things that he found that from the years 1948 to 1949, I think, and recall that the top leadership of the Communist Party were indicted in spring of 1948. And so that first 2 years, what Henry Winston found was that contrary to what we've been led, which is that people left the Communist Party in droves and that the political repression achieved its impact, the contrary happens to be the case, which was from those two periods, somewhere in the ballpark of about 15% of the party membership did not renew. So you think about that today and the amount of political repression that is being, being faced by activists in the streets protesting for Black lives, and you magnify that by the court cases and the FBI surveillance and the intimidation and infiltration and people losing their jobs and their livelihood, and only 15% of the party did not renew its membership. This is pretty significant. And so Henry Winston provides a very interesting glimpse into the internal workings of the Communist Party and its own internal analysis of the early impact of the Red Scare and McCarthy era. And so we follow Henry Winston into the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And one of the most important contributions that Winston made in the 1970s, for example, is that he became, as the historian Gerald Horne noted, the moving force behind the creation of what was called the National Anti-Imperialist Movement in solidarity with African liberation. Now, NAMSOL for short became one of the leading domestic organizations to spearhead the fight against apartheid South Africa. Again, hardly a marginal force, and the communists were leading a nationwide organization in support of their comrades within the ANC, the African National Congress, and the South African Communist Party to help defeat apartheid in South Africa. And one of the early initiatives that NAMSOL took on, and mind you, this was before the creation of the internet and social media and move on petitions and those types of things, was the collecting of 100,000 signatures to deliver to the United Nations, calling for the United Nations to kick South Africa out of its body, and as well as other activities that local NAMSOL chapters took on. But Henry Winston was the driving force behind this organization. Oh, okay, I'm kind of moving kind of slow, aren't I? I need to maybe pick up the pace a little bit. So the next chapter, chapter 5, deals with Judith LeBlanc. Many of you may be aware of Judith because of her work today, her leadership work in the Standing Rock movement and the Dakota Access Pipeline, fight against that. Judith is today the executive director of the Native Organizers Alliance, and had been since at least 1973, 1974, a leader of the Communist Party. And what we find with Judith's story, and this is a pretty fascinating story, is that she cut her political teeth, so to speak, as an activist participating in the historic standoff at Wounded Knee. And she was I'm trying to think, not a lawyer, but a legal aid, helping to document and take affidavit statements of people that were participating. And she and another comrade by the name of Lonnie Nelson participated in that standoff in 1973. And what she told me when I interviewed her for this book was that it was her relationship to other communists who were also at Wounded Knee that led her to make the decision to join the Communist Party. Again, far from a marginal political force. So if we follow Judith's story forward into the mid-1970s and 1980s, we also see that she ran a campaign for Senate, U.S. Senate, in Boston against the brother of who has now become a notorious crime boss, who was captured a number of years ago, Whitey Bulger. There was a movie made about him a couple years ago, and so Judith actually ran against the brother of this notorious crime boss as a communist, as a woman Native American communist, and that's a very important point to make. Moving forward, Judith also helped to articulate the party's stance around Native American rights and activism within the Communist Party, and write extensively about that. If we kind of move her story forward into the late 1990s and early 2000s, and she became the executive director of a public access TV show that the party initiated called Change in America. Now, Change in America ran for, I want to say, 3 seasons, and it became one of the most popular public access political TV shows initiated by communists. Union halls would order copies of VHS copies of Change in America, and they would show Change in America episodes at the Union Hall at union meetings. And Change in America ultimately won a number of different public access TV and independent media awards, and was in many ways a precursor to what became the modern independent media movement in the early 2000s. And Judith and other communists would travel around the country interviewing rank and file union members, different union leaders like Leo Gerard from the Steelworkers, Linda Chavez Thompson, who was the vice president of the AFL-CIO, et cetera, et cetera. And Change in America played a very important role while in this period in time when there was this transition from the kind of big three TV stations to independent TV and public access TV, and then now what we have with the internet and the independent media movement that is so much bigger and broader. Change in America was also in Seattle at the battle in Seattle against the World Trade Organization, and video documented many of the protests and speakers and repression that was faced, by protesters, when the police attacked and pepper sprayed and all of that. And then we move forward just a couple more years, and Judith becomes a leader of the largest peace coalition of the 21st century, United for Peace and Justice. And so all of these lives are kind of captured in Let Them Tremble, and I try to tell as much about these people and their political lives. These are political biographies as I can in about 20,000 words. And then the final chapter, W. Alpheus Hunton, is a very fascinating character. W. Alpheus Hunton, who was a Howard University professor in the 1930s, becomes a founding leader of the National Negro Congress in the 1930s, works very closely with a number of different communists like Doxey Wilkerson, who was another African-American communist at Howard University, joins the party in 1936, 1937, eventually leaves Howard University, joins Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois, as well as other comrades, to lead the Council on African Affairs. And like NAMSL, the National Anti-Imperialist Movement in Solidarity with African Liberation, the Council on African Affairs was the main domestic organization to spearhead the fight against apartheid in South Africa. Now, apartheid came to South Africa in 1947, 1948, and the Council on African Affairs, which existed from the late 1930s, early 1940s till the mid-1950s, was the main domestic organization spearheading the fight against apartheid in South Africa and publicizing the brutal barbarity of the apartheid regime. At a time when the United States and other countries were turning a blind eye to apartheid, it was the communists in the Council on African Affairs that really brought the attention, brought this repression and barbarity to the public. They would organize massive Madison Square Garden rallies of 15,000 people to protest apartheid. The Council on African Affairs published a number of different newsletters and journals that were banned throughout Africa because they were so influential and so informative. Eventually, the council, like a number of other party-led organizations, was forced to dissolve by the 1950s, the mid-1950s, but it played a very, very important role. And Alpheus Hunton himself, after the dissolution of the Council on African Affairs, ended up writing a book called Decision in Africa, which W.E.B. Du Bois, the most prominent of African-American scholars, called a landmark exposition of, the situation in Africa and the effects of colonialism and imperialism on the continent. And so afterwards, by the early 1960s, W. Alpheus Hunton had been invited by W.E.B. Du Bois to move to Ghana, where Du Bois was at the time working on the Encyclopedia Africana. And Hunton, of course, was very excited to work with his friend Du Bois on this major project, the Encyclopedia Africana, and which after Du Bois's death in 63, 64, Hunton became the executive secretary of this project and spearheaded it until the 1966 coup, which ousted the progressive socialist leadership of Ghana at the time. And then Alpheus dies shortly thereafter, a few years later, and his story ends. But one of the things that's really important about Alpheus Hunton and that I try to highlight in this book is that among his contemporaries, W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, other prominent Black activists and intellectuals, Hunton was considered one of the most important African-American intellectuals of the 20th century, even though he's largely forgotten and neglected today. And so I really hope that this chapter in Let Them Tremble helps to shed more light on his life and bring more attention to Alpheus Hunton and his amazing contributions to the struggles for African-American equality and Black liberation in Africa. So that's pretty much Let Them Tremble in a nutshell. Real quickly, the book that I'm working on right now, Faith in the Masses, Essays Celebrating 100 Years of the Communist Party. The genesis of that book started last fall, where after Let Them Tremble went to production, I started approaching a network of other historians and academics who write extensively on the history of the Communist Party, about writing a series of essays also celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the birth of the Communist Party from a number of different perspectives and angles. And I'm happy to report that that book is nearly done, and that it should be in physical form by mid to late November. And I hope that people, are really interested in it as well. I just now realized that I've been talking for like 40 minutes, and so I'm going to stop, and maybe we can have some questions or a discussion. Sorry for taking so long.
No, not at all. Thank you so much for your time, Tony. I loved it. Thank you so much.